If you travel to Egypt, you'll encounter some major monuments, most famously the pyramids, but also the great colossal statues at Abu Simbel or the great temples in Thebes. You also encounter some other great monuments that are of more recent vintage, things like the Suez Canal along the Sinai Desert, or maybe the great dam in Aswan. And you might ask yourself, well, how did they come into being? When was it built? Why was it built? Well, stay tuned because we are going to explore that today as we study the history of Egypt under the rule of Gamal Abdel Nasser. Stay tuned. In the previous video, I gave you a general overview of the Middle East in the recent past. I won't go over the material again, but basically the big story was that in the Middle East there's a sense of decline and a debate as to what would be the proper way forward, whether we should have an authoritarian ruler pushing the country into modernity, have more democratic practices, or have a return to Muslim fundamentalist roots and Sharia law. Egypt is a good case study of that because it goes through that kind of process of starting with a sense of decline and then a tug of war between those different solutions going forward. So let's look at that in detail. When would be the last time when Egypt had kind of a big golden age? When you think about Egypt, what do you think? Obviously, you think about the pyramids, which are indeed great. But if you look at the date on it, they're pretty old, something like 2700 BC, almost 5,000 years ago, the time of the Pharaohs. And it's great to have built all these things, but it does say something about your country that people associate you with something that happened 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. What have you done for me lately? Well, the Pharaohs lasted for very long, almost 3,000 years, but by the time you got to about 300 BC, Egypt started being the subject of many foreign invasions. Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, among many other places in the Middle East, and after his death, you had a dynasty of kings, of pharaohs of Greek descent, the so-called Ptolemaic dynasty, the last of which would be the very famous queen Cleopatra. She was Greek. So even though they're pharaohs of Egypt, in a way they are foreigners, they are Greek-speaking, or multilingual in the case of Cleopatra. She spoke many languages. Well, Cleopatra herself ended up being overthrown. That's during the time of the Roman civil wars. It's a bit complicated, just watch the whole series Rome from HBO to get the full story. But in the end, she and her husband, Mark Antony, were eventually forced into suicide when Octavian conquered Egypt. And Cleopatra would be the last of the pharaohs of Egypt. After her life, so that's the 1st century BC, Egypt became a province of Rome. So another foreign ruler, you go from a Greek set of pharaohs to Roman overlords. And that's not over, because after the Roman Empire disappeared, then its successors would control the region. And then after that, the Arabs, by the 600s and 700s, come into the scene and they conquer Egypt themselves. At some point, you also have a dynasty of slaves called the Mamelukes, and they conquer Egypt as well. And then you have the appearance of another great Muslim dynasty, the Ottomans from Turkey, and they control the Middle East, including Egypt, for much of the period from the 1200s to the early 1900s. With the exception of 1798, when the French Revolution sent one of its ambitious generals, Napoleon Bonaparte, to Egypt to conquer it from the Ottomans. He did so successfully, though he only spent a bit of time in Egypt and then returned to France to continue the road that would lead him all the way to being emperor of Europe, while the remnants of the French army were eventually expelled from Egypt, and you go back to Ottoman rule. Also in the 19th century, yet another set of kings ruled Egypt, and these ones would be of Albanian descent. And it's kind of weird to think of a small country like Albania providing the kings that controlled Egypt, and yet somehow they did. So if you start to tally and you go from one foreign ruler to another, you start wondering, well, when were they ruled by really truly local native rulers? Well, not since the days when Alexander the Great had conquered 300 BC or so. So there's a sense of decline in 19th century Egypt. One of the Albanian kings of Egypt decided that he would push the country forward largely through some big public construction project. Must be something about being king in Egypt. When you're surrounded by the pyramids, you feel a lot of pressure to build big things yourself. And he built a lot, museums, schools, roads, palace for himself. But the big project in the end was a canal through the Sinai Desert called the Suez Canal, after a city there. This was a joint French-Egyptian project. The main backer for it was a French diplomat called Ferdinand de Lesseps, who in 1859 arranged for a private company to be set up. Half of the money would come from French investors, the other half from Egypt. And half of the workforce would come from France, specifically engineers and such, and the remainder would come from Egypt, including a lot of Egyptian peasants that would be conscripted into building the Suez Canal. This was a major endeavor and a successful one. After 10 years of work in 1869, the Suez Canal opened to great fanfare. And if you're a fan of the opera, you might know that the great opera by Giuseppe Verdi, Aida, was commissioned specifically to be played for the opening ceremonies of the Suez Canal. So that's why it has an Egyptian theme. So when the canal opened in 1869, it immediately became one of the great passageways of world commerce, which it still is. And that might mean that Egypt not only was back on the map. It might become important again, except that this king of Egypt that I mentioned was a very big spender, a spendthrift, spent so much that he got into a cash shortage. And at that point, you borrow money from banks and they expect some collateral, and the collateral that he provided would be his shares in the Suez Canal Company. Eventually he defaulted altogether, and so the banks repossessed his assets, including his shares in the Suez Canal. Those banks happened to be British, and so by the late 19th century, the Suez Canal, even though it was built in Egypt, on Egyptian soil, in large part with Egyptian money and Egyptian labor, ended up being controlled by a foreign company that was half French and half British. So what was supposed to be the revival of Egypt turned into yet another major humiliation. And to top it off, the British were not content simply with controlling the Suez Canal. They decided to take over the entire country and turn it into a protectorate. They kept the Albanian kings, but they would be more like a puppet head after that, with the British ruling over that up until the 20th century. So that's kind of the situation by the 20th century, one of deep decline and disaffection in Egypt. Since the country that used to be one of the dominant ones in ancient times has now gone through a long series of foreign rulers, Albanian, British more recently, and that the one big project that was supposed to revitalize the region, the Suez Canal, was owned by a foreign company. So what is the way forward? And we've identified three possible solutions: either a democratic, free market democracy, or a more authoritarian kind of modernization movement, or a more traditionalist Muslim fundamentalist agenda. But the person that came to the fore in the 1950s in Egypt was more of the second scenario, authoritarian modernizer. His name was Gamal Abdel Nasser. He was from Egypt, the northern part in the Delta, as I recall, from a poor background. His parents were Egyptian peasants, and initially went into the army. He was an officer. And just like the modernizers in Turkey around World War I, the so-called Young Turks, those officers in the army would be the modernizer that wanted to push Egypt forward. They call themselves the free officers. As such, they organized a coup d'etat, revolution in 1952, where they overthrew the last of the Albanian kings, pushed out the British altogether, and then Egypt finally became the independent country that it ought to be. After elbowing out his rivals, Gamal Abdel Nasser emerged victorious, and that's how he liked to portray himself, as the first truly Egyptian ruler of Egypt since last of the Pharaohs in the first millennium BC. So what was his agenda? Well, to understand his agenda, it's easy. He wrote a book about it called The Philosophy of the Revolution, which is probably still in print, and there are English translations. I remember reading that when I worked on my master's thesis. And the book is kind of weird. It's sometimes been compared to Mein Kampf, the book written by Adolf Hitler, because there's a strong anti-Semitic tone to it. He was Muslim. He had fought in the war in 1948 against Israel, and then was associated with two more wars in 1956 and 1967, and that's a big part of his agenda, an anti-Semitic tone of destroying the state of Israel and pushing the Jewish people into the sea. So that's item number one. Beyond that, he was not truly a Muslim fundamentalist. He did not want to create a Muslim state governed by Sharia, Muslim law. There was a group that wanted to do that. It's called the Society of Muslim Brothers. They are the Muslim fundamentalist group in Egypt. But he was at odds with them. Nasser actually sent them to prison and banned the party and so forth. That was not what he had in mind. He wanted a secular vision for Egypt, where people might be Muslim in their spare time, but the state itself would be secular, not attached to a particular religion. Beyond that, he was a big fan of the Arab people, and Arab in that case being an ethnic group, not a faith. You have a lot of Arabs in the Middle East, all the way from Morocco, from Algeria, North Africa, and places from like Saudi Arabia and Iraq. And he thought if all these Arabs banded together as one group, then they would be a strong force in world affairs. And instead, they were divided into 15 or 20 small countries, and that's why they were weak. So there's a desire to unite all the Arabs into one group, what was called the Pan-Arabist Movement. And we've seen some of that in the class. We talked about Kwame Nkrumah, the Prime Minister of Ghana, uniting all Africans into United States of Africa. And we also talked about the non-aligned movement, where a number of countries and former colonies, the conference of Bandung in Indonesia in 1955, dreamed of creating a third world, a bloc of former colonies, and this way they would be strong in world affairs. So those big movements for confederation, that was part of the talk in the 1950s and 60s as a way to have more equality between Western powers and others. So he dreamed of creating a pan-Arab union, which would be centered around Egypt, and that means that him, as a dictator of Egypt, would now be dictator of the entire Muslim areas or Arab areas in the Middle East. So that made him quite popular for a while among all Arabs of the region. He was a great orator. That's another kind of comparison you can make between him and Hitler. A great orator, he could whip up the crowds, and he would be listened to throughout the region. So all the rulers from Algeria to, Saudi Arabia and so forth, would be very worried of him because, well, he wants a huge job, basically. Beyond that, his main agenda was to modernize Egypt. Egypt at that point in the 50s was relying mostly on tourism income to some extent, but mostly the agriculture and especially the export of cotton. That's what is the main export of Egypt back then. So the idea would be to industrialize Egypt, to have more things beyond agriculture, and within the field of agriculture to have more cotton to export to get foreign cash. So how do you do that? Well, looking at the map of Egypt, the geography kind of constrains what you can do. It's a large country, but most of it is part of the Sahara Desert or the arid areas of the Middle East. And so the vast bulk of the population of Egypt then and now would be pushed into a narrow strip of land all across Egypt and into the delta in the north, and that's obviously the Nile River and the Nile Delta. So if you want to expand agriculture, you need more land, and that means more water. And if you want to expand industry, you also need power for that. That means more electricity. Where could you get that? Well, his idea was to build a dam across the Nile River in the southern part of Egypt next to Aswan, and that would serve several purposes. By having a dam, you would have water control projects, meaning that the flooding that would happen downriver in the Nile would no longer happen. You would control the water throughout the year. Because traditionally in Egypt, once a year, there would be a major flood where the water would overshoot its bank and cover the areas by the Nile River. So you would end that. By having a big reservoir behind that dam, what eventually became Lake Nasser, named after himself, then you would have a lot of places where you could tap for water to irrigate more land. The land is plentiful, the people are plentiful, what you need is water. And so the dam would provide that. So you could have more agriculture and thus more cotton exports and more foreign cash into Egypt. And finally, if you have a differential in water between the Lake Nasser and the Nile River below, you just put some turbines there, and through the magic of physics, you create electricity. And that would allow you to have some industrialization. So that's kind of the plan that Nasser had. The issue, though, was to get the money to build the dam, which was a huge, very expensive project. Egypt did not have the cash, and whatever benefits you would get from the dam would be years and years after you had completed the dam. So you need a lot of upfront cash. He tried to borrow from different countries, including the US. John Foster Dulles, the US Secretary of State, kind of reneged on a promise. And so for lack of cash, Nasser decided, well, let's seize one source of cash that we do have in the country, and that is the Suez Canal, which had been built long before, but was still a very reliable foreign company that would spit out cash year in and year out because the canal had long been paid for, but every year, every ship that would go through that would have to pay a toll. And so that's how you could get money for your dam, seize the Suez Canal, which was in foreign hands. But that's part also of the nationalistic movement that we've seen in the 50s and 60s. There was a lot of push during that period to control your national assets. People realized it was not enough to be politically independent, to have a country of your own, to be decolonized. it was also important to control your economic assets, otherwise you would be still dependent on a former colonial power. We saw that in Latin America, where countries like Chile would be dependent on copper companies owned by the US. Or a lot of the land in Guatemala producing bananas would be owned by the United Fruit Company in the US. Or places like Cuba tried to nationalize their assets under Fidel Castro. We'll see next time when we talk about Mossadegh in Iran, that it was also pushed to nationalize the oil over there. So that's kind of the plan that Nasser had, to nationalize the Suez Canal, the most important asset in the country, so that it would be truly owned by Egypt and Egypt would be truly independent. He announced that in July of '56, and the reaction from France and Britain, the owners of the canal, was as predicted. They didn't want to let it go. So that led to what is known as the Suez Crisis of '56. And after several months of fruitless negotiations, in October of that year, October '56, France and Britain, allying themselves with Israel, and Israel had reason of its own to hate Nasser since he threatened to destroy Israel on multiple occasions, banded together to attack Egypt, specifically the area around the Suez Canal. It's kind of a weird crisis in that Israel, France, and Britain were successful militarily and controlled the canal, but there was a lot of pressure worldwide to end the fighting, specifically coming from the United States and Russia, which is kind of weird. It's the middle of the Cold War. It's rare to see the US and Russia on the same side of any given issue. Suez Crisis might be the only time that ever happened. And so the two of them combined successfully put pressure on Britain to end the fighting, and then France and Israel had to follow suit. And so when the dust settled, Nasser, even though he had lost the battle on the ground, was able to keep control of the Suez Canal, and so that made him, in the end, diplomatically victorious. And that was really the high watermark of his regime, where he had kind of given a big middle finger to France and Britain and somehow gotten away with it. And the Suez Canal ever since has been in Egyptian hands. And so the money will now go into the coffers of Egypt. He was also able to get some loans and engineering help from Russia and then built the canal. So as we move forward and try to assess whether Nasser was successful, there are different ways to look at it. Did he control the Suez Canal? Yes, he gained control of that. The long-term impact was not as successful as he had hoped, because in the 1970s you have some important fighting against Israel, and the border was alongside the Sinai Desert on the other side of the Suez Canal, so that for many years the canal was no longer passable. So that kind of cut down into the profit that Egypt expected from it. Also, in the long run, ships keep getting bigger, and so the canal is fairly small, and all of the big ships could not fit through it even after it reopened, and so still went around the coast of Africa. It's changing nowadays. Egypt has opened some new passageways in the Suez Canal to allow bigger ships to make it through that, so it might become more relevant again in the future. But the profits from the canal, initially at least, were not as great as expected due to the ongoing war with Israel and the blockage of the Suez Canal. What about the Aswan Dam? Well, it was built, so that's a success, but one that was not as profitable as expected, because it turned out that it kind of messed up the environment in Egypt. That annual flood of the Nile would no longer happen, and it was, in a way, a pretty good thing for people downriver, because it would bring you water free to your fields, and also when the waters receded, it would leave behind a big layer of silt that would be quite important in replenishing the fields of Egypt, and that's the reason why this area had been so fertile in the ancient world. So that was gone. Kind of a similar situation to what we've had here in Louisiana, where after a massive set of floods in the 1920s, the Army Corps of Engineers decided to put levees alongside the Mississippi River, which has protected Louisiana most of the time from floods, but that means there's no layer of silt that is deposited in South Louisiana, and the entire state has a tendency to sink into the Gulf of Mexico, and we lose a lot of coastline that way. It's always dangerous to kind of mess up with the environment in that sense. The silt that hasn't made it downriver on the Nile tends to be backed up in Lake Nasser, just above the dam, and so the amount of water that is stored there is not quite what was expected, and that limits the amount of irrigation that you could do upriver. Also, it has a tendency to muck up turbines, limiting the industrial output for hydroelectric power. So it's a bit of a mixed bag in that regard. The idea to create a pan-Arab state, that was also a mixed result. He, for a while, managed to convince Syria and Yemen to join Egypt into a big United Arab Republic, UAR for short. But eventually those two states withdrew, and eventually the UAR was just Egypt. The vast bulk of the Arab states of the Middle East did not want to join a big confederacy led by Gamal Abdel Nasser. And it's understandable. If you are Ahmed Ben Bella in Algeria and just fought a long war of independence against France, the last thing you want to do is then lose control of your own country to be part of a larger kind of an Egyptian empire led by Nasser. So that in the long run did not pan out, and today if you look at the map of the Middle East, it's still divided between dozens of smaller states, including Egypt. What about the long-term economic development of Egypt? Well, the dam and the canal were not enough to turn Egypt into a rich country. It has a large population, so not enough jobs for such a large growing population. And Egypt is not one of the poorest countries in Africa by any stretch, but it's not rich by international standards. It's one of these middling economies. It doesn't have much oil either compared with other areas in the Middle East. The one thing that it could develop would be tourism, because a lot of tourists, including myself, would love to go to see Egypt and the pyramids and so forth. However, with the unstable political situation, and we'll get back to it in a minute, the tourism is definitely not as strong as it could be either. What about the last big agenda for Nasser, and that was to destroy the Israeli state? Well, we had a video on modern Israel. Remember that Israel won all its wars, including the one in '56 over the Suez Canal against Nasser. That was the first humiliation, at least on the battlefield. Then there was another battle in '67, the so-called Six-Day War, which was a major triumph for Israel, meaning a major humiliation for Nasser, who after many years of trumpeting everywhere that he was going to destroy Israel, ended up being being defeated in decisive fashion. He actually proposed to resign in '67 because that was such a big blow to him. He did remain in office and then died in 1970 of a heart attack. So it's kind of a mixed result. And Nasser is still viewed today with great reverence in Egypt, but it is a mixed result. So much so that his successors by the 1970s decided to mend fences with Israel and eventually made a deal with Israel at the Camp David Agreement in '78 to make peace with Israel, in exchange for which Israel returned the Sinai Desert back to Egypt. Ever since then, Egypt has been kind of governed by the same authoritarian modernist model. One leader that was very long-lasting was Hosni Mubarak, who ruled in the 80s, 90s, all the way into the early 21st century, and kind of continued that nationalistic approach that Nasser had of trying to develop Egypt, but within a very strong secular authoritarian kind of environment with modest results economically speaking. That changed in the 21st century when the Arab Spring took effect, meaning that there were a number of demonstrations in various Arab states, including Egypt, in Cairo, where people were tired with that long list of authoritarian rulers that promised big but did not quite deliver, decided to revolt and ask for greater democratic traditions. That was successful in ousting Hosni Mubarak, and then for what looked like another scenario might take hold in Egypt, a more democratic environment, at least until elections were held and the Muslim Brotherhood won those elections, the very party that Nasser had tried to eradicate. And so rather than let the Muslim Brotherhood take over, the army staged a coup, and now Egypt, I'm taping that in 2019, is back to being a dictatorship led by a local ruler called Sisi, as I recall. So that's it. Now you know all about the history of modern Egypt. Next time we're going to step forward and move all the way to a fascinating country, Iran, also known as Persia, where the story will be remarkably similar.